And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage-porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us, where links to Coalition 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and now even some 4.0 are up here as we migrated from basic basement internet radio to the state-of-the-art facility we maintain here, high in the bunker, high above the streets of Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of, well, about 300,000 stories. And as always, our spiritual leaders are here, our spirit animals, Spiro Agnew and Dick Cheney are sitting right with me. Tonight represents a very special evening. Over the last week or so, we've had an opportunity to host a variety of presidential candidates who are all competing in the mosh pit known as the race for the nomination to be the candidate for the Libertarian Party for the President of the United States in the year 2020, the year of our Lord. I say it's a mosh pit. It's a friendly mosh pit. It's a warm, it's a fuzzy mosh pit. But at the same time, we got about 16, 20 people, shoulders, elbowing, hair pulling, but only in the best possible way. I've likened the race to something like a rugby match. We get in the scrum, play hard. At the end, we shake hands, have a beer or some form of alternative ameliorating mood substance, and then we carry on, lather, rinse, cycle, repeat, or however that goes. Tonight's special because there's someone I met. In fact, I think folks, I think Des Lindsay, I gave her this picture last night. She's circulating it online, of someone I met first in 2016 in Orlando, that magic city, the city of hopes and dreams, where everyone is happy, the happiest place in the world. And it's where I first got to meet the gentleman about to join me now. We had a brief conversation. We took me and Tony Jones, who's one of the spiritual leaders, if you will, of the independent media movement here in Rhode Island, in the greater Providence, Rhode Island metropolitan area, as well as one of the new spiritual leaders of the Libertarian movement. And of course, I'm talking about our guest tonight, Vermin Supreme. Vermin, welcome to the Coalition.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. Thank you for having me this evening and giving me the opportunity to join your audience.
There you go. Now it's been fun because we had the opportunity, and we'll repost the video. The first time we ever really got to sit and chat was, appropriately enough, at a meet and greet at a tavern in Boston. About it was only 4 or 5 months ago, but in terms of COVID years, COVID years being like dog years, it seems like about 20 years ago. It was a great night. There was a great turnout to meet and greet. Beers were had, and we just kind of had a casual conversation, the kind of conversation two guys talking the movement in a bar with good beer, surrounded by friends and new and old. So we got to know you a little bit, but this is an opportunity to maybe have a little bit of a different conversation than you typically had. There's been some wonderful debates that have been held by a variety of affiliates around the nation, and you, to your credit, have joined a bunch of them. And it's at this moment in the show that I always point out the personal sacrifice, the efforts that were made by, I think, really one of the best set of candidates in our lifetime. We've got some wonderful people who are running for office. As we found out, there are some differences in terms of how they interpret the libertarian philosophy. Many of them are remarkably on the same page, yet coming from vastly different backgrounds, vastly different experiences. But one of the most patriotic things you can do in America as a country is, in fact, run for public office. And in doing so, it's a great sacrifice to your personal time, your family time. You meet a lot of wonderful people. It's physically exhausting, and it's expensive. And when you do it from the grassroots consistently, very often your personal life is subsidizing your political life. And that's why I want to point out that regardless of the turnout, regardless of who wins, that I think we need to take a moment and celebrate our candidates. Because, again, they've accomplished something that I haven't seen in my brief time in the movement, about 10, 12 years, which is, in their own way, and sometimes in their own very unique way, as we're about to discuss, go out and really apostolize, if you will, evangelize for the movement. And in doing so, I think on a high level, in talking about issues, they've done it in a way that the duopoly is frankly incapable of. So Vermin, I thank you for that, because even with your own unique take on things, multiple ties tonight, and even with your own.
Oh yes, in fact, it's an innovation that I've been working on. It's a mask, a COVID mask made of neckties.
So,
And since I generally wear a dozen ties anyway, I figured that would be a good way to keep the COVID down, if you will.
mm-hmm.
And thank you for that very kind introduction and your very kind shout out to all of the candidates who has been running this election cycle. Of course, for me, I think one of the most beautiful things about running for president is that it is a self-declarative statement. All you have to do once you say those magic words that you are running for president, my name is so and so, and I'm running for president, it becomes an indisputable fact. It becomes no one can prove otherwise. I mean, you don't have to file with the FEC or get any votes or get any donation, but just the fact that you say you are, and if you are a little bit, you are in fact. And by extension, the Libertarian Party is very welcoming. It's a very Democratic Party in that way, in that pretty much they welcome anybody who says, claims, or is running for president, because once you say you are, you're not claiming it, you are, as a libertarian. All you have to do is, so the first step is I'm running for president, and then I'm running for president as a libertarian. And in that way, you can participate in the debates, and the debates have been a pretty amazing learning experience for me, of course. Pretty much, for the past 30 years, my main mode of communication has been using the full-on satire and humor in order to critique the duopoly and the political system at large. And so this was the first time that I was sort of forced into this almost it's not another character, but it's serious vermin. It's another type of me relating specifically to libertarian audiences and trying to lay out the case why I am the best candidate under the circumstances. And that has been a very interesting thing. Just the debate format itself. You have any number of libertarian candidates, and a lot of times they're answering the same questions, and they're just all trying to figure out a different way to give the libertarian response to the question. And that has sort of allowed me to be free enough that I can pretty much quip with a joke or a quip, and then steer it back to the platform itself. Because, of course, when I decided to be a shill, if you will, a candidate for the Libertarian Party, I felt it was very important to present to the public what the party is, what its meaning is. And I believe that is indeed perfectly encapsulated in the platform itself. And so I've been doing a lot of trying to steer people to the LP platform, and seeing and just asking them to find out how much of the Venn diagram we share, where we agree. And
mm-hmm.
if you have some questions or disagreements, we can certainly discuss those and try and put it in a framework where it is acceptable or understandable. Yes.
No, so let's start at the very beginning, because again, you've been very clear on your political ideas. We'll go over them certainly. I want to give plenty of time, and we have the beauty of indie media is we have as much time or as little time as you need to be able to do that. We can leave no stone unturned. If there's something, whether it be in the currency of the COVID crisis that you want to talk about for the first time, that's fine. Again, we always talk about a few things and we set out a few ground rules, if you will, in the coalition. The first is we revere the independent candidate. You are, if you will, the expression of the psychology, the spirit of this show. In doing so, we refuse to engage in the type of behavior that the duopoly, in concert with the mainstream media, is obsessed with, and that's called handicapping candidates. And what they do constantly is, it's not, will he win? Will he win? What will he have to say to people to get them to convince them to win, as opposed to what he really means? What will we say to people in terms of fundraising so he can present proper numbers? Who's going to win, and what order are they going to win? What impact is going to win? We're not interested in any of the nonsense, the periphery nonsense. We're not interested in your fundraising. We're not interested really in anything other than, say, the issues. And just as importantly, not if you're going to win, why you should. And that should not be a revolutionary statement in American media. Yet, when I say that to people, they seem almost astonished because so little of the press coverage surrounding either pre or during COVID has been about why someone should be the leader of the, if you will, of the free world. So I want to put that out there, and that's sort of our ground rules. And we won't even touch on any of those issues tonight. But I want to find out a little bit more about you, the person, because I think people have been intrigued by that. You have been you've been attending a number of libertarian conventions, to your credit, on the national level over several years now. That's where we first met. But you're a product. You're a product of Boston, if you will. You're a New England guy. You know, you if you will, early on in your life, you represented as a Republican, or well, almost really as an anarchist. What was the political birth of both you? When did you become radicalized, politicized, libertarianized, and what was the actual birth, the cause for the birth of Vermin Supreme? When Vermin Supreme entered the world?
Well, they're a little bit different topics, but I can tell you because you're mentioning Massachusetts, I did attend Gloucester High School, and I'd say that was probably where I had my first sort of, I don't know if you'd call it radical, but a political act, if you will. And it was in the 70s, late 70s, and the entire Gloucester High School hockey team was suspended for use of speed. And as a result, the local newspaper decided that there was a drug problem. And back in those days, essentially, you'd have 100 people, at least 100 kids before school waiting outside. We were called the Canal Club, and the kid would come off the joint kid would come off the school bus with the joints and sell a quick 100 joint, bucket joint, and we'd all be smoking the 1970s marijuana before class. And it was no big deal, and didn't affect my school performance, I don't believe. But once the newspaper decided that there was this situation, that it was a drug problem, the police took notice, and so they set up a snooping station, a spy station across the canal with these binoculars, and they would see somebody with the weed, and they would radio over to the cop car, and the cop car would come whipping around the corner, and they would arrest some kids. And it was several days that this happened, and yet the kids weren't really taking precautions or heed. And one of my good friends was one of the first kids nabbed. So I decided to make a public service announcement, and I made a cartoon. It was Big Pig is Watching You. And, of course, it was a police officer characterized as a pig and through binoculars and like that. And back in those days, you know, that was way before Kinko's or anything like that, and I had a friend, luckily, who was working in a print shop, and he was able to whip off a quick 500, and I think that was probably my first meme. I took him into the school the next morning, and they just got inhaled, sucked up, and everywhere. They were postered on everybody's locker. They plastered them all over the cop car that came up to make the afternoon arrest, and one of the kids who got arrested that day had them on their person, and of course the police waved it in their face and said, "This is going in your permanent record."
Dun dun dun.
Everybody pretty much knew it was me, but they couldn't prove it, and it was no real big deal. But it was a lot of fun, and it definitely gave me some notoriety even back then. And as a result of that, I was elected mayor for the day, and that was a funny story because my friend Jimmy, who had actually been kicked out of school, he was suspended because he was an alcoholic at the time. We were partying the night before, drinking beer, and it's like, hey, we have an idea. Why don't you put on your three-piece suit and grab your camera, and we'll tell him you're the school photographer. And that is exactly what we did. And we met the mayor of Gloucester, Leo Alper, and we drove into Boston and met Francis X. Bellotti, and he took us out to lunch, and it was it was a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, we had the reveal, and it's like, well, you know, Jimmy's not really the school photographer, and I'm Big Pig is watching you, and it was a good time, and I guess it was a little bit of a prank. So those were my first high school political acts. Although I don't believe I wasn't politically aware or politically conscious at that time. Then in Baltimore, I lived in Baltimore for bunch of years from about 80 to 87. And I was doing bookings and promotions at a couple of nightclubs. And that is where I became Vermin Supreme. It was in 1985. It was sort of tail end of the punk rock days. And like I say, it was the art weirdo circuit. And so a lot of people were taking on personas and alter egos and for stage work or performance work or musical
Yeah,
work.
but those were
And
wonderful. Those
so
were
yes,
wonderful days. Those were. I mean, that's when
indeed.
That's when John Waters came out of Baltimore. That's when groups like Talking Heads emerged. That's when Elvis Costello was the angry young Elvis Costello who essentially blew up every set and blew up Saturday Night Live. That's when it was. You know, we were first experiment. It was the first time we put pins through our ears and pins through our nose, and that's those were astonishing times. It was before HIV. It was before everything became so very, very serious. You could be a crackpot and of the highest order and make astonishing points at a time.
Absolutely.
Oh,
I mean, there was a lot of people doing a lot of weird things. I remember one Thanksgiving. My friends actually during the 3 Mile Island meltdown,
oh
a
yeah.
number of my artist friends went. They instead of running away from 3 Mile Island, they drove from Baltimore to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and made a Baltimore Oblivion marching band. And they were playing these toy instruments, and they were dressed up in foil, and they were waving road flares in the air. And people did not know what to make of it because there was so much confusion surrounding it. That was their response to the total confusion that was occurring, to go up and create a little bit more. And we followed that up with an event where we took over the Thanksgiving Day program, and we probably had about 30 or so total art bizarros, and we had these wild floats. I was able to convince the graduate sculpture department at MICA to uh, build a life-size drone missile
Mhm.
on the back of their truck, so it was a little bit like Red Square. We also went to this turkey slaughterhouse and recorded the turkeys there, and we were playing them through all these synthesizers and loops, and we had like a woman who was dressed up like Turkey Christ on a cross, and we had live turkeys, and we had turkeys on sticks, and it was just like total sensory overload, and it was just pure uh, anarchist, surrealist, Dada Operation Mindfuck stuff. And those were the type of things where I was picking up those chops of pushing the weirdness and the alternative reality levels.
Mhm.
And eventually, I burnt out on Baltimore and was ready to leave Baltimore, but not before one night when I was trying to find an interesting project to captivate me. I declared that I was going to run for mayor of Baltimore, and that was in 1986. But shortly thereafter, my reason for being in Baltimore totally collapsed. I had no reason to be there anymore. And luckily, the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, that was a big peace march that went from LA to DC back in 86, rolled through town. And my roommate popped home one day and said, "Hey, Vermin, this guy's from the Great Peace March." And I'm like, "Really? Okay." And I went and looked at it, and it was this amazing sight in Memorial Stadium parking lot.
Yep.
5,000 people walking to DC with the entire infrastructure, mobile infrastructure that was required to move that amount of people down the road. It included dozens of porta potties on trailers. It involved that they had their own sewer pumping truck. They had their own water trucks. They had their own kitchens. They had their own prep trailers. They had their own reefer trucks for all the food. They had semi trucks hauling people's 2 milk crates of possessions they were allowed, and hauling their tents that they set up every night. And it was just, and they had school buses that actually acted as schools because there were so many kids on the march. They had like a K through 8 and a high school, and just in a town hall. They had a mobile zip code. So I was totally blown away by this and had never seen anything like it, and knew that was the direction that I was going to take. Went to a thrift store, grabbed a change of clothing, a sleeping bag, and walked to DC with this group of people. And that is where I first encountered some, anarchists, politically active anarchists, and they turned out to be wonderful people. And we spent the weekend doing political actions, they were throwing all their shoes over the White House fence that they had walked across the country with, and there was rallies and concerts and just all of these wonderful things. And I was so inspired that when I heard that they were a small group of this people was making a spin-off, um, that I wanted to be part of that. So they were called Seeds of Peace. It was a voluntary collective. They were able to purchase some of the equipment. I think they had a kitchen, a prep trailer, and that one of the porta potty trucks, and a water trailer, and a few smaller vehicles to tow them. And I began to join them on various anti-nuclear marches, anti-nuclear weapon marches, from Kings Bay, Georgia, to Florida, where there was like backcountry actions, people like invading Cape Canaveral to postpone testing and things like that. And then we spent a lot of time out at the Nevada nuclear test site. Um, and then a little time passed, and I realized, oh my goodness, I said I was going to run for mayor of Baltimore. And so I did a month-long drug study. I was a human lab rat. Uh,
Hmm.
Earned $1,000 for being in there in a month testing those pharmaceutical drugs for them. And then I took that money, got some computer typesetting because that's the way it was done back then, and hired and paid for some printing because it was before the widespread use of print of Kinkos and shit. And so I went back to Baltimore with the woman I had met in the meantime, who I've lived with for 30 years now, Becky, and some friends of ours from the peace marches, and we went to Baltimore. And once again, by running for mayor, it really entailed just me going and saying, "Hi, I'm Vermin Supreme. I'm running for mayor of Baltimore." But nonetheless, we put up these posters that said, "Vermin Supreme is your mayor. Demand a recount." And got a little bit of press and had a lot of fun on the streets, and definitely. So that was my first experience of bringing a fictitious political campaign into reality. And at that time, once again, it wasn't particularly political. Also, at this time, in addition to attending the national political events that started giving me national notoriety, I started attending the Rainbow Gatherings. Are you familiar with the Rainbow Gatherings?
Yep.
The Rainbow
But
Family of Living, Love, and Light. They gather
mhm.
every year. It's a temporary autonomous zone, 10 to 20,000 people in the woods, and it requires its very own, a very large infrastructure. There's up to 100 different kitchens, and they all have a lot of them have water lines from springs, and um, there's 10, 15, or 1,000 or more people, and so there's so much going on there it is all you know things that happen there. Vegetables need to be chopped, food needs to be cooked, stoves need to be built, shitters need to be dug, um, and water needs to be put down, and there's workshops and entertainment and all of these wonderful things. It's like a yearly festival. It's a non-commercial event, and so essentially it's financed by the magic hat, people voluntarily tossing into this magic hat that goes around, and the banking council counts the money, and then anybody can join the banking council and the kitchen interface. But there's all these councils, and the only reason and the only way that anything happens at all that makes this whole uh, monstrosity occur is that people see the need and they agree to do it. They come together. It's like, oh, we need to dig another shithole. Let's go. Who wants to join me? Oh, we need to go to the lot and get all the food supplies and bring them back. Who will join me? How are we going to tap this spring? Let's sit down and think about this. Oh my goodness, there's a dispute over here. Let's figure that out. And so it's a leaderless, non-hierarchical, um, anarchistic event. It doesn't self-identify as such, but that's what it functions as. And so I started attending these events, and that is sort of where I learned to be a clown and push the limits on what I could do that might be funny, and just doing things to entertain people. And I was doing talent shows and things like that. And after several years, I also saw that one of the main functions that we provided was security for ourselves. Because if we don't do it, who is? The cops aren't going to help us. No, we have a very oppositional, anti-authoritarian relationship with the law enforcement officers at these events. And so essentially, the security team is sort of like it's glorified camp counselors,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times it involves crisis intervention. So we're always intervening in potentially dangerous situations or dealing with something that had happened and trying to counsel with us as a people to try and figure things out between somebody who was aggrieved and uh, and the person who caused that problem. And so we were all about restorative justice and trying to figure out alternative methods of dealing with problematic behavior. And one of the other things that we do as our security team would give escorts, not sexual escorts, just escorting the police at these events, because the National Forest Service will spend sometimes up to $1 million on the law enforcement organization, the incident command team that comes in to set up roadblocks, to shake people down, to ticket people for nudity, for not leashing their dogs, for any number of infractions, and sometimes they do it in a way that causes real problems. And so, by walking with these, and so I would spend 8 hours a day, 8 hour shift walking with, eight Alabama State troopers, for example, from one end of camp to the other, trying to keep them out of trouble, trying to warn the hippies that the cops are coming. We shout out six up and things of that nature. And so I was able to I was able to uh, integrate my clowning activities into this crisis intervention, to this dealing with police situation. And from there, it was just a short leap to bringing out my tactics and skill set out into a political demonstration riot world, where I discovered that if I could intervene, because you have your protesters here and your cops there, and the space in between is sort of this place where anything could happen and often does. Sometimes it'll be like a cop doing something stupid, like taking a cheap shot with a pepper spray, or maybe a protester does something stupid, runs up to a cop or something, and then all hell breaks loose. And I discovered that I could take over that space by using my bullhorn, by cracking jokes on the cops, by reading from riot control manuals to lay the groundwork from what I expected of the cops, and that type of activity. And so I was doing these things, and from the Rainbow Gathering, where that's a national event with people from all around the country, and the political actions also. This is where those were my first my first constituent bases, if you will, where I became a well-known figure for just being me and doing the things that I do. And I also, along the way, started bringing the imaginary satirical presidential campaign up to New Hampshire because it was close by. And the New Hampshire primary is a small state, but every last darn candidate goes there. And they all have campaign headquarters, they all have staff, they all have events, and they're bouncing around. Talk about like you know, the wrestling thing you were referring. No, it's much more like a demolition derby up there. It's like it's crazy, and media from around the country and around the globe comes there because it has such an outsized importance as the first primary in the
Right.
nation. And so I went up there and started using that as a tactic to get media by interacting with the other duopoly candidates and asking them really wacky questions, which I always found elicited a much more enlightening response than any normal question could. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one time I asked John McCain about the mandatory toothbrushing, and he said, "Oh yes, he supported it. Um, in fact, his campaign staff, Lynn, hides in people's bathrooms late at night to make sure they brush their teeth." So, I mean, he played right into it and gave a pretty weird response. Lamar Alexander, one time, in response to a question in '96 when he was running, he said, "Well," he pulls me aside and goes, "Yes, Vermin. In fact, I do have Elvis Presley imprisoned in the underneath the governor's mansion for committing heinous acts," he told me, unquote. And so a lot of you get a lot of much more interesting answers, I think, by asking these off the wall questions. And
Well,
by
I
doing
get,
that,
mm-hmm.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, obviously, I've got a couple of questions for you, though, relative to everything you brought up. Number one, how important is it, for particularly when you're a candidate in the grassroots, or whether you're satirical or not, is to go bring the proposition, whether outrageous or deadly politically serious? How important is it that you learn quickly to bring the question to the media as opposed to waiting for the media to come to you?
Oh, right off the bat, I always realized that the media, the people, especially, I mean, just the people who work in the media and for the media, I always realized was a very important audience. And some of the earliest campaigns in '92, I would go out of my way to actually go to newspapers and knock on their door and demand an end to the media blackout. And same with stations, and almost always ignored, but a couple of times I got a good bite. And I was always playing to the media, even though I knew very well that I wasn't going to make it past their editors. And but and it took me many years before I started trickling past the editors into the news stream, if you will.
Right.
But yes, absolutely, that's
The,
very true. Okay. Seize the day and seize the media.
No, no, I'm with you 100%. We as libertarians sometimes get very resentful that we're not being paid attention to, and I don't think they understand the chemistry that has to occur between a candidate, whether it be an issue, a candidate for an elective office, and the news cycle. It's something, for some it's intuitive, others it's learned, but it's critical that you understand. Now, a couple of other concepts about this period, because as someone who worked in New York City during the heyday of the ACT UP movement, as someone who was saw very quickly up front in here in New England the Occupy movement, political theater has always been very near and dear to my heart. To me, political theater is a grotesquely misunderstood and grotesquely underrated avenue to achieve political gain and therefore engage in society, behavioral change in society. There's another libertarian activist. I don't know if you've met him. He served on the LNC, and he's a thinker. And I enjoy always my conversations with a guy named David Demarest. There's a philosophy that I think.
Oh yes, I know David.
Yeah,
we met. He had me out at the Unconvention last year, or
right.
maybe 2 years ago, and that was a very nice time. It was very nice hanging out with him, and they actually made me their official greeter. I was actually working the door at that event, and so I was sort of like the Walmart greeter for the Libertarian Unconvention that time. And it was good time.
One of the thoughts that he's working on, he's been working on a lot, is the notion of moving away, if you will, from titles and chairmanships of this and chairmanships of that and committees, and creating an environment where spontaneous reactions can rise up, almost as if planned, if you will. The seed is planted in people that when a problem arises or a challenge arises, people with the appropriate talents, or sometimes the inappropriate talents, rise up together and work almost organically to approach and solve problems or challenges, or perhaps even initiatives.
I did not know that David was such an anarchist. Yay!
Absolutely. And by the way, I love your reaction to this. Smarter people than I have written, the notion that we are all anarchists. Every day in our lives is an exercise in anarchy. We just don't really think of it that way. Even during the days of COVID,
Absolutely.
Every day is an act of anarchy.
That premise in particular is very anarchist in a proposal that just the organic organization that occurs and that idea. I mean, I've pointed that out time and time again. Anarchists are not opposed to expertise or leaders per se. I mean, if somebody has a specific expertise in a specific area, yes, they are worthy of following through that particular project. But if it goes to somewhere else that they have no expertise in, well, they cannot lead because they have no reason to, and no reason for anybody to follow them at that point. So it's very consistent, and once again, that's one of the things that I very much enjoy about the Libertarian Party because it is the only party that welcomes anarchists. It's a
Hmm.
coalition of anarchists and minarchists working together to slowly dismantle the state or what have you. And that's one of the things that made me feel right at home, quite frankly. I mean, what other political party would accept an anarchist, let alone an anarchist like myself that is so enjoys absurdity as a communication strategy on such a level. Um, when I attended the 2016 convention, I was so impressed by the Libertarian Party for allowing me to have so much fun with the conventions of a convention, uh, and not throw me out on my ear. I mean, that was pretty amazing to me, and definitely led me to um, realizing that I had found a group of folks that I could really hang with.
Excellent. Now, there's another
Right.
concept that you brought up, which I think really resonates in America today, particularly when you look at us as a, and I know it's almost as if COVID has wiped out all sorts of institutional memories about very specific events and how they relate to the body politic in the last 5 or 10 years. One of the most important events that I believe has happened in America with regard to the both civil liberties and the criminal justice system is, of course, Ferguson. And as an outgrowth of that, of course, Staten Island. A half a dozen cities have blown up because of the police state and the war on drugs and actions that, because of the persistent presence of an authoritative militarized police, has generated these cathartic events. In the wake of Ferguson, restorative justice has become a very important concept. Talk about your early, because you're talking about years before it's become the subject of sociology books and chat rooms. What's your concept of restorative justice, and where does that play in a post-state world?
Excuse me. Little too much vaping there. Well, I think anything that we can do to steer people away from being sucked into the mass incarceration industrial complex is a very important thing, and I think it seems like some actual courts that have taken up that cause, and that is a very I guess encouraging. I mean, it's the whole system is such a rotten, vicious mess that it's but our experiences has always been that it is best to try and make the person who has wronged somebody understand that and accept responsibility for that, and in finding out from the victim or the person who was wronged what it would take to make it right. And sometimes it's as simple as an apology. Um, Other times it's more. It's having to make something up with physical things, or I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the Rainbow Gathering, and especially because it is almost a glimpse at a possible post-state society, and all possibilities are open. Um, and and what kind of enforcement mechanisms? I mean, true, if somebody has been victimized, we do give them the opportunity. I think, but we know that we allow them to understand that one of their options is to interface with the law enforcement arm of the whatever. So that's an option we give them. We don't deny them that opportunity or option, but we definitely encourage, ideally that we can work something out in the council process,
Hmm.
where we have a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of people uh, who have different perspectives, and we try and communicate why such behavior is unacceptable and wrong, and try and make that person understand that. Um, and sometimes people are escorted off the land as a result. Sometimes they are given a 24/7 shadow, somebody who's with them, just to make sure that they don't do that again or whatever. There have been things like a shame parade, a couple of years back at this one kitchen. This gentleman who had a history of behavior that was a little beyond acceptable. Um, did one more thing, and that was that. And there was 3 days of councils, 3 days of councils with 50, 70 or more people trying to synthesize how to respond to this situation that we found ourselves in, whereby this individual did not want to take part in the council process. And so, a lot of the olders, people who had been through a lot of things, gave our 2 cents and told them how we had dealt with similar situations. And then we sort of let the kids have it. It's like, tell you what, you all figure it out. You find a non-violent resolution to this situation. And they did. And that turned out to be a parade of shame. It was a full-on shame parade. It was like out of Hunger Games or some sort of weird movie, but all, hundred plus people are there with signs and noisemakers and yelling and just, shaming this person for their aberrant behavior and essentially trying to shun them from the community. Shunning, so there are different things and different solutions, but, I've certainly been involved in plenty of different movies, as the vernacular refers to them, where just doing shuttle diplomacy, trying to find out from one person what it'll take to make them feel a little bit better about what happened, because there's no changing what happened, but there's trying to deal with what's going on. We pay special attention to the person who was on the receiving end, and then we'll get to the asshole who fucking did it.
Well, and the beauty of that is in a stateless society, the term pipeline to prison is used a lot currently in the current political vernacular, if you will, and it's I think it's an apt one because there is a steady progress made because of societal issues, if you will, that are enforced by Leo, the popo.
Yeah.
And as a result, you take folks who are regular folks who probably have a couple issues, and it might be financial, it might be educational, it might be health, and for some reason government finds them in the position of being a rule breaker, and we can't have rules broken, and then all of a sudden you're in this where the guy steals a loaf of bread literally and ends up in jail. All that's missing is that dude
Right.
Valjean.
And then dead from COVID.
Right. And it's literally happening just about 2 or 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now. There's a group of well-meaning citizens who are engaged in active political theater against a for-profit for-profit prison that was dropped, like, as I call it, an economic bomb in the middle of a tiny little city called Central Falls, Rhode Island. It's like so many cases, I call it governmental economic racism because this community was encouraged to accept this for all these fallacious claims about how much money it would be to the community and what it would provide employment and all the usual crap. And as a result, you've got the first outbreak. The situations inside the prison are terrible. You had the first announced case of COVID in the prison, and of course, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide in these places. I mean, everything is communal. That's not going to change, and it becomes a sense of petri dish. And most of the folks in that prison it's a holding cell, I believe, and most of the clients there are federal detainees. Some of them are there for immigration issues. So we've taken arbitrarily built borders enforced by a state mechanism, which is now turned into criminality, which is now turned into effectively a life sentence or maybe even a death sentence. And yes, I think you and I have a problem with that, and that needs to stop. And
it's an outrage. It's definitely my top personal issues, the things that stick in my craw the most, are the mass incarceration, the police state, the surveillance, the ridiculous laws, the enforcement, the militarization of police, and the criminalization of behavior that it has no victims to complain about it. It's so interweaved at this point. It's like the one leads into the other. They can't exist with it. It's such a horrible Gordian's knot of fucking terribleness.
Right, and so I alluding to Les Mis. We've got this we look at this movie, Les Miserables, or whatever the play is. Haven't seen it, haven't been. Caught about 5 minutes of it. Watch the guy who has the talents come out of his hands try and sing. That was it for me, babe. Ultimately,
Wait a minute, is that Wolverine?
Yeah, with Wolverine. Yeah, Wolverine is in freaking Les Mis. I can't accept that. There's a cultural divide there. I'm sorry, I can't overcome. Wolverine should not be doing show tunes. Sorry. just shouldn't. But I digress. So we call it here the pipeline to prison because effectively it becomes a direct shuttle, if you will. Someone incurs the wrath of Khan, if you will, for a civil infraction, and their inability to pay the fines or associated with the civil infraction ends up leading them to being, if you will, shunned from society because they can't get a driver's license, or all of a sudden they can't re-register their car, and then all of a sudden they're guilty of some sort of criminal complaint, and it in the old Saturday Night Live skit, it all leads to beer, except it doesn't. It dramatically alters their lives. People are ripped from their families and placed into these hellholes. And now the added element is we ended the death penalty in most places in this country, except now we've got the reinstitution through the, if you will, criminalization of COVID. Yikes.
Yeah.
Folks,
of course, if I was president, I would make COVID against the law. And if you were in possession of COVID, you would be in violation of that.
Absolutely. Folks, if you're just joining us, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient media. We're here in the bunker. Again, we've got a unique, talk about confluence. We've got Vermin Supreme, who's joining, if you will. You can't see them behind me, are the spirits, if you will, Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew, a proud Marylander, a proud Baltimorean, is one of our heroes, as well as Dick Cheney. We find them to be our two favorite vice presidents of all time. By the way, folks, if you've got a vice president that you love and admire and look to as your savior, we want to know. But Vermin's joined us, and maybe the conversation is a little offbeat, but what I try to have is I'm trying to understand people, where they come from, what their thoughts are, how they got to that point. Now, the type of organizations, you can't call them organizations, the type of events you're talking about, the rainbow and just all these different movements, ultimately, I believe, were the met their culmination, if you will, in Occupy. Were you involved in Occupy at all at any level? What did you think of the Occupy movement?
I was so close. I had heard rumblings about it, and I was like, should I go? And I reached out to some people I knew, and I did not hear back. I couldn't get a confirmation that it was a thing. So I wasn't right away. I did get an opportunity to go to Zuccotti Park a couple times, and it was pretty interesting. The first time I walked up on it, I ended up intervening on some guy who was pulling a knife on somebody else. So that was exciting and right up my alley, I suppose. And it was indeed an inspirational thing. And I took more part in Occupy Boston. I was able to make that more regularly because that was certainly closer. So I was trying to make it down there weekly, and knew many of the people involved, and it was very inspirational. I was inspired. I think I always get inspired every time one of these new movements swells up and moves up and brings in so many young people. I guess it just reminds me of when I was their age. Really, as an old person, you look back. Well, when I was that age, and that's where I met all these wonderful people that I still work with, still am in touch with. 30 years later, and I'm just knowing that they will be working on issues together with each other for the next 30 years, and they will be able to mentor and inspire the next generation. And to see that is it just does my heart so much good. We did Occupy the primary in New Hampshire in 2012. That was probably one of the last Occupy style moves. And I definitely threw down with Occupy pretty hard in Tampa, Florida at the RNC, where the police were convinced that I was the leader of Occupy, just because I had the boot on my head, apparently.
We did have
Occupy the primary up in New Hampshire, and that was a wonderful event because it did draw out a bunch of the Occupy leaning identify people, and of course, New Hampshire has the Free State Project,
Right.
the big libertarian project that has encouraged so many people to move there to try and play with their politics. And so at any given event, we were at Santorum, we were at Newt Gingrich, we were just at all these duopoly candidates. You could have over here, you'd have the occupiers, and then over there, you'd have the free staters, and they're protesting the same candidates, maybe for different reasons. At any moment, they could both unify and become a Vermin Supreme rally. And that was pretty beautiful. And of course, the thing about New Hampshire is that it's such a small state. Most of the people who are activists on the left and right are very familiar with each other, and they know each other, and they've been working together for years. And so there's no real acrimony or venom between them, unlike at the in a larger world context where people who disagree are really at serious odds, I'm afraid.
Let's go
So
to.
yes, and in fact, if you watch the movie Who is Vermin Supreme? I don't know
Mhm.
if you've seen that. It's a feature-length documentary made by filmmaker Steve Underick,
Mhm.
and it covers the NATO summit protests. And in 2012, that's where I met him, where I was doing a lot of police wrangling and cop whispering and shit like that. And it's a very good document of my career, if you can identify that as such. But it also puts what I did in the context of the Occupy movement. And I
Right.
think at first when I saw the movie, I thought he was giving me a little too much credit, because I didn't feel my involvement was so strong with the Occupy. But ultimately, I believe I was a very a bigger figure than I deserve to be, perhaps, which I guess it's just my life, I guess, when you get right down to it.
Talk to me about straight pride in Boston.
Well, the Straight Pride Parade in Boston was sponsored by the Super Happy Fun America, and of course they are an offshoot or an extension of Resist Marxism, which is a cover for an organization that has a lot of ties to the alt right, far right, Proud Boys, a lot of very unsavory, sketchy, violent um, people, douchebags, I guess I want to say. And they had the two events in Boston. The one right after Charlottesville, and that one got shut down before it should. Um, but it was, they're they're they are people that I really don't like very much at all. And and yes, they came up with this idea of a straight pride parade as a a trolling event. And I guess from what I can sort of gather, that they intended it to be a critique, if you will, of identity politics. But obviously, the it was generally perceived as fully punching down at the LGBTQ and on and on, or yes, and
Right.
communities, and so there was obviously a lot of people who were against that, and I went down to protest that event. I ended up actually attempting to rebrand it as douchebag pride, and through my bullhorn, I was repeatedly uh, welcoming people to the douchebag pride parade. I'm a douchebag, you're a douchebag, yay, douchebag pride, yay! And it was a little odd, also. And of course they had Milo Yiannopoulos
Yeah.
as their grand marshal, and I started taunting him. I was pretending him that I was a bill collector, and he was like, "Hey, Milo, I'm with your bill collection agency. You owe us a lot of money. We really want to talk to you," and things of that amusing nature. And and then I guess the Boston police were very annoying, extremely annoying. They pulled this stunt that I was not familiar with in my many years of working in crowd situations. They pulled up with about 30, 40 police motorcycles side by side, and they all cranked up this ear splitting their sirens, and it
Mm.
was a sonic. They were using it as a sonic weapon against the people who were trying to protest the Straight Pride event, and that was extremely annoying. I mean, they were so loud. I had my bullhorn on full blast, and I was like inches away from the cops in their ear, telling to shut, turn that shit off. And I don't think they could hear me. It was right up there with an LRAD. I can only imagine the decibel levels that they were using at that time. Um,
Yeah,
and
what
so
was the
the
point of that? You were there. A number of us in the libertarian movement contemplated going to protest, but we realized that, and I don't know, this could be just being weak, but what your fear is, you're going to conflate the libertarian movement with that people are going to, particularly in the lazy media, are going to then make a connection as if we're supporting, because they simply won't decide just to do that. I was not there, despite living probably 30 or 40 miles away. Why did
there were a number of libertarians there for sure. People that I knew who were protesting the event. Yes.
right? So you've got free speech.
I mean, yes.
As,
Yeah. The Libertarian Party platform affirms freedom of speech. It
mhm,
does. Doesn't believe the government should, make up laws against speech.
mhm,
But it certainly does not preclude counter speech and
right.
protest speech. And it's always been a speech versus counter speech issue for me, I guess. And so, yeah, I
Well,
mean, yes, they have that right to do that kind of troll to cost the city that all that money for security, and just because we find it tasteless and terrible. And of course, one of the awkward things for me, quite frankly, is my fan base, because it spans the political spectrum. Um, I had fans on the other side of the parade, in the parade, participants in the parade who were uh, friendly or liked me, and they were like, "Hey, Vermin," and I'm like, "Oh, Jesus, please, why?" Um, so
right.
that's always
Well, I mean, think
awkward.
you and I are old enough to remember Illinois, the Chicago Skokie, with the American Nazis. I mean, it's been well affirmed that minus physical threats, tasteless, disgusting free speech is in fact free speech. You are allowed to, in fact, as libertarians, we often encourage people to engage in free speech just so we know who they are, as opposed to physically or through the use of legal channels prohibiting contact between people or prohibiting people from expressing themselves. I find it's just better to know exactly what I'm dealing with. So allow someone to talk and allow
Sure,
someone to express that. But I as
but
someone
then
who wasn't there. I'm just, why was there such an effort by the police to shut down counter protesters? Or that's my perception. I could be wrong there, but let me know.
there it well, I will say that the police definitely it went after the protesters more so than the people they were protecting. They were protecting the other side, the super happy fun nasties, and I don't know. That's just the way they generally. I don't know why they were so ornery, quite frankly. I mean, they came through, um, and then they just started trying to clear out the street. And of course, a very basic crowd control tenet, which I always try and encourage them to follow, is let the crowd disperse on its own accord. There's no better way and sensible way to allow a crowd to disperse than to let it disperse or let it be a march or whatever. They were. It was taking over a road, but ultimately, my perspective, and they were allowed to be there. And I guess the permit expired or whatever. The agreement was this cops thought they had. Um, Ultimately, number one, it's a public space. It's a public street. I believe it's included in public assembly. And number two, and it's a point that I've always brought to the police in these situations, just treat it like any other situation that causes a temporary blockage of a street. It could be a car accident. It could be a construction project. It could be any number of things. And all it takes is a little bit of a detour. And so I have a real problem with it when people just freak out and trot out those chestnuts. Well, what about an ambulance or whatever? And like that, it's like, yes, there's such a thing as rerouting traffic around a street that is being temporarily used for either free expression or a construction project or a car accident. Any of those things. It's okay. It's a block party, for example. You detour around it. I just don't get that part. There's so much. People get so freaking crazy about that one.
Well, it was interesting here in Rhode Island a few years back. There's an organization called DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, and I think of them at least spiritually, if you will, as a precursor to the Black Lives Movement. And they had a protest, and part of it spilled out onto a highway, and people had that same reaction. Listen. I kind of get their point, but I wish people were as reactive to other infringements on their civil liberties as they were on people creating a traffic jam by blocking a freaking highway. It baffles me. But what was fascinating about it was I pointed out to a couple. Of course, there was all the outrage porn in the world was going on at that point, and outrage porn is our number one issue here at the Coalition. We oppose outrage porn at every level. So there are all sorts of people ginning people up about how this movement had blocked the highway, until I found through the miracle of the internet in IP addresses a reference to a banking bill and a banking collapse that had taken place in Rhode Island a mere 10 or 15 years before that, and white folks from the burbs were arrested for blocking a highway. Oof. Talk about awkward moments.
Yeah. Good for goose, good for gander. And of course, in Boston at the Straight Pride thing, there was pepper spray flying, and once a whole bunch of people got pepper sprayed, and once they started reviewing the tapes, it was just one cop that was doing all the spraying. So I guess he was the designated pepper spray guy or some bullshit. But
he won the short
move, and
he won the short straw for the week.
They did attack the protesters before the parade and during the parade and after the parade, and it was absolutely ridiculous. And of course, I even heard that one libertarian candidate spoke at the event.
That's another conversation.
Yeah,
totally. This is a political interview per se, so we have to do the right thing. We have to speak to the issues. What of the issues, you guys completed, or actually didn't complete, unfortunately, because of what's happened with COVID, a pretty rigorous debate schedule.
Absolutely.
And again, these were in-person, multi-hour events, partially because that's what libertarians obsess over, are issues, and partially because so many people were running, and to the eternal credit of so many state affiliates that opened up their doors to literally in some cases, just about every libertarian candidate who was willing to incur the expense and the time to come there. And I give them the ultimate credit. Out of all the issues that you've seen discussed on the serious side of issues, what single issue, if there is one, resonates with you personally as a candidate the most? What did you take away from this?
Well, I think it goes back to my earlier comments that it's definitely the mass incarceration and police state situation in our country. And it's just extremely problematic for me as a person who wants to be free and exist free from such fuckery, to know that so many people are in prison for profit and for nonprofit or for whatever, and the racial disproportionality of it is insane. And just the fact that we can do that as a society, and a society turn a blind eye towards it, and you just don't hear such an outcry. And even though so many people are directly affected by it, because there's so many people in prison, and it's just frightens me to no end.
Yeah, the Rhode Island chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, which we're blessed here in the smallest state in America to have one of the most aggressive ACLUs in the country, released a statement that something effective, and I'm going to be posting this on the Coalition website tonight, something effective, it's like a 3-to-1 ratio of African Americans who are arrested or not arrested because we've gone to a decrim thing here, but are the subject of ticketing, if you will, by Leo for this. And again, we all know that really the only thing difference, and I know I'm trivializing something serious here, but bear with me. The only difference between the rich kids and the poor kids is the rich kids do better drugs and crash more expensive cars. So despite, and this is why I believe incrementalism is the devil, despite all the efforts made to decriminalize behavior, which still means you're part of the government pipeline of prison, ultimately at some level, if you fall afoul of all the things that they've decriminalized, despite all that shit and all that nonsense, we are still engaging in the same type of stupidity as we did pre-Ferguson, pre-Staten Island. For folks not familiar with Staten Island, understand a guy got essentially murdered for selling Lucy's, which are individual cigarettes, on a street corner in New York City in the year 2000. What was it, 18, 19? Breathtaking. So
Edward Garner.
Yes. That type of crap still exists. It's why, and I'm going to ask you for your reaction to this. It's my belief that unless we go full-born, and unless we advocate for a radically libertarian society, as close to anarchy as we can get, that ultimately these, despite superficial legal changes, like quote unquote, they use the word decriminalization, that ultimately the government cancer will regrow and find new ways to essentially use our behavior, use normal individual behavior to institutionalize us. Is that true?
Sadly, of course it is. It seems like that is just a natural trajectory of government and its desire to control the citizenry. And obviously I think that's accelerating by leaps and bounds in the willingness of people to defer to an autocratic executive, for example. I mean, for an executive that makes claims of being the final authority on all things, and these are super crazy times. And I think it's always been, for me, it's always been, oh my goodness, is it going to be environmental collapse that gets us first, or is it going to be this government clampdown, or the government clampdown getting ready for the environmental collapse, and then we get hit with this total curveball, which is really fits into all the planning. Even though they were totally unprepared for the event to deal with it effectively, they were more than prepared to enforce things, because that's right. What they are equipped to do. They weren't equipped to deal with a public health emergency, but they were certainly prepared to jack you up and harass you if you're out in public or whatever.
Right. No, that's an outstanding way to juxtapose the two situations, because despite the fact that government, and this is my principal issue with this situation, is government has essentially hijacked the free market and hijacked innovation in so many sectors of our society, and their, if you will, their propensity for that over the last generation effectively created a situation where free market practices that could have been in place in the years running up to this could have not prevented COVID-19, but it certainly could have mitigated its effects. And of course, I'm talking about things like
absolutely,
free market solutions for healthcare. Here in the state of Rhode Island, folks, where I am, they viciously attacked the establishment of these personally owned, God forbid, owned in the private market, in the dreaded private sector, all these urgent care centers. Right over the border of Massachusetts is an urgent care center that has COVID testing ability. Imagine if a dozen or 20 of those had already existed in the state of Rhode Island. Imagine what could have been done so much earlier. And particularly in these facilities tend to pop up in what's called hospital deserts, where there are a few hospitals existing to support the community because they can't make enough money, all right, because the free market isn't in place to drive prices down. So you have this cumulative effect. In the state of Rhode Island, the principal barrier to quote-unquote renormalizing, if you will, I don't even know if that's a word, is in fact that there are still active hotspots occurring in economically challenged, economically marginalized communities who were unable to react as quickly as possible because, A, the government failed in their hostile takeover of American medical system, and they didn't allow anyone else in either. So, boy, we sure showed them we're not going to deliver healthcare efficiently as a government, but we're sure not going to let anybody else do it. Whew. Brutal crap.
Brutal. Super fumble. And it's obviously we're in a position where it's like, oh yeah, it looks I think the stock market's coming back, but on the other hand, the unemployment rate is the worst in the Great Depression. I mean, there seems to be this disconnect. And I think a lot of people are, the stock market, and there was this disconnect that actually meant something. That's just a place where people gamble on the future of companies. I'm going to give me these shares because I bet they'll do better in the future. Based on what happened in the past, but has no bearing on the present or certainly a lot of people's bottom line and how, paying the rent. Just because the Wall Street is doing great does not mean that people are going to be able to pay their rent.
Your principal opponent in the general election, as we call him here, Orange Cheeto. In fact, up until a couple months ago, his big claim was, as we say in libertarian land, my 401k. Of course, he refused to acknowledge publicly that the state, if you will, was engaged in the type of quantitative easing that only Barack Obama could have dreamed about, the same quantitative easing that was one of the precipitative causes of the Tea Party movement. But ruh-roh, that was different then. That was their boss. Now we got our boss, so it's okay. Because everything is morally relative.
Let me assure you that the Federal Pony Reserve is going to be run a lot different. When we get the Federal Pony Reserve, we'll be making very sound pony-based decisions for the economy. I think the important thing to understand, of course, is that once we have universal pony ownership, we will have equity in the ponies that we own, and then we will be able to borrow against that class of pony-based debt, which we will be able to bring in the smartest and the brightest from all the Ivy League schools who will be able to create impossible to understand, impenetrable, and incomprehensible financial pony-based instruments, which will create a giant pony debt bubble in the economy. And of course, when we have a bubble in the economy, it's a great thing because Wall Street's doing great, all cylinders are firing, everybody's making money. And unfortunately, a lot of bubbles burst. But this one is going to be reinforced and steel belted and last forever. Thank you. I'm Vermin Supreme.
My only question is, if I'm a libertarian, does that mean I only get a miniature pony as opposed to the full-size ponies?
If you're lucky, because in pony world, the smaller the pony is, it's actually considerably worth more.
Oh, okay.
Many people ask me, Vermin, are we going to be actually using ponies, this literal currency? And I say, no, of course not. That would be ridiculous until we can get the scientists to make them very, very small. And that's part of my COVID battle. Our plan is to be able to create raise a whole bunch of microscopic ponies, much like Incredible Journey, get the shrink ray going, and I'll have the cavalry of microscopic ponies battling COVID. Literally, it'll be very exciting. And speaking of COVID, of course, I had mentioned making it against the law, but I'm also going to go back in time and kill baby COVID. That's one plan. And the other one is to build an antimicrobial wall around the country.
Damn.
Antimicrobial and antiviral. And I believe I will build a moat and fill it with Purell. And that should keep the country safe from COVID. Thank you.
Excellent. In our last segment,
you'll apologize for me slipping into some of that famous wacky Vermin Supreme.
Listen. We want the whole package here, but if you could, in sort of the last segment, we're going to give you ample opportunity to engage in what we call here as shameless self-promotion. But ultimately, can you talk to people? And this is one of the brass tacks issues, if you will. Explain to folks the incredible power of satire and the hold it has on the American imagination, as well as being a direct commentary on the actual electoral process itself.
Wow, that's a really tall order. But yeah, ultimately, humor has toppled governments, I think. I mean, humor can poke holes. It can be a very fine weapon, and satire has definitely proven time and time again to just point out how absolutely absurd the system is. And satirists, I mean, heck, the possibilities. I mean, look at the Ukraine. We have a former television comedian who's now the president. Um, so I have found at least that in my own experience that this humor and the satire has gotten to points and said things that if I had said in a different way, simply would have been ignored or not heard or countered somehow. I mean, satire has been used throughout history to make serious critiques. From um Jonathan Swift to Gulliver in Gulliver's Travels and in his modest proposal. Oh my goodness, the modest proposal was truly one of the most outrageous, outlandish pranks ever, convincing people that eating babies, having the Irish eat their baby would be a reasonable solution to their famine, and all the way up to the Yippies, who uh, understood the idea of being able to manipulate the media and manipulate reality, and by making extremely outlandish claims. They claimed that they were going to pour LSD into the water supply in Chicago in '68 during the convention. A physical impossibility. It would not have worked, but they still had all these guards. National Guard guarding the darn place. They took over Disney World just by having a Yippie Day, and too many hippies were there, and they just locked it down and brought in the National Guard to protect the Magic Kingdom. And I have just always been impressed with the ability and the transformative powers of humor to reach deeper truths and reach people who would not listen to such a thing otherwise.
If you're familiar at all with the ACT UP movement in New York and across the country, but it was primarily strong on the coast, the ACT UP movement was conceived by the gay rights community during the period, if you will, and the ramp up to the recognition that HIV was in fact an international epidemic. ACT UP used extreme political humor, rather extreme at times, and managed to single-handedly change the course, if you will, of the worldwide health industry. Before that, research was primarily dedicated towards heart disease and to a variety of ailments, cancer, and managed to, not within a generation, within a couple of years, literally change the course of medical history so that the focus was on the cure for HIV. And as a result, the things like the drug cocktail were invented, researched, designed, whatever, primarily, I believe, to my death, because of the outrageous political humor generated by ACT UP. Political humor and satire can change the world. To me,
Indeed, and that is part and parcel of what I hope to bring to the Libertarian Party. That is what I am putting on the table. My 20s, my 30 years of satirical campaigning has brought me a level of notoriety and of national fan base that is just part and parcel of the package that I'm presenting. I believe that I'm not so much seeking the nomination or running for the nomination as I am trying to put an offer on the table, presenting this offer that includes the character that I've developed, this imaginary world, and this media. The media knows me, the people know me, and I have this wonderful reservoir of political capital and goodwill um, that I believe could certainly bring in a whole lot of new faces to our party and a whole lot of new blood and new ideas, and yeah. So
And to your and
and
to
I
your
think humor can do that.
and to your credit, you've already done that. You've
Thank
impacted,
you.
particularly in the Northeast, where you're based, had a very strong impact on the New Hampshire part. I happen to be, in my libertarian capacity, I am the alternate to Region 8 for the Libertarian National Committee, which sounds very, very important, but I'm not. But
It does.
it what it prompted me to do that
Hey,
before.
hey, who do we have to kneecap?
He's another fan up in New Hampshire. He's a good guy. But I am the alternate. But it gave me the opportunity, and I've always had the opportunity, I should say. But it spurred me on to go to a number of affiliate conventions in this past election cycle before things got to lockdown. So I was there during the debate, and I got to meet people. And I again, you've developed a very strong following over a handful of years as really becoming hyperactive, if you will, in the party on multiple levels. But it's the message in and of itself can be challenging to people. We're literally asking folks in a time when government presence, as we literally speak right now at this moment, has reached a heavy-handed level that has been, quite frankly, limited to movies about Hunger Games or the dystopic, and now all of a sudden, there are elements of it that are appearing in reality. So we're asking people, and if you will, during a time of crisis, both existential and real, to throw off what's perceived as the protective cloak of government, or as the Obaministas called it, the federal family. Boy, the federal family. Think about that. But we were asking people to throw off that protection and essentially put themselves out into the wild, where their own behavior, their own skills, their own ability to coalesce with people, to your point about all these different adventures that you've been on, their ability to coalesce with people of complementary skills is going to what to get them to survive, not the false security implied by the protective warmth of your federal family. And it's got to be frightening as hell. So if you don't incorporate, whether it be humor or a genuine outreach to this, people will look at us and they will scoff, and they will they won't reach that first level of understanding. We won't be able to plant that seed that Larry Sharp has advocated for so on many occasions. And so it's got to be part of the toolkit. It just has to.
I mean, I believe it's extremely important to note that during this whole crisis, I think for the vast majority of Americans, that the federal government has not been knocking on their door to check on them. The federal government has not been calling them up to ask them how they are. No, that is our neighbors and our friends. Our neighbors and our friends have called us, and we have called our friends and our neighbors to help us get through this crisis. The federal government has not been responsible or done anything to bring any elderly neighbors groceries. No, that is something that we are doing. They have not reached out to help the homeless. No, that is something that we are doing and many libertarians are doing. They have not set up alternative feeding school lunch programs, much like the Ohio Libertarian Party has done, to service the kids who might not get another meal out of the day because they ain't getting their school lunch. So it has been this wave, this whole layer of mutual aid and volunteerism and charitable acts and helping one another and compassion and our love for each other and humanity that is guiding us through this event. Every day that I do this evening live stream, sometimes with an actual stream, and sometimes it's the ocean. I'm just trying to bring about, an hour's worth of nature for people who are locked up in their apartments or what have you. And I fully encourage them, to check in on the people that we need to check in on, the friends who may be prone to anxiety or depression, and trying to encourage people to start the gift economy right now. Start giving things to people. Look around your house. What do you got? What would make a nice present for somebody you like or know, who could use it that you might not need any, uh, just to get people thinking alternatives, trying to um, just make people aware that that's the only thing that's going to get us through this mess is is being responsible for ourselves and for others. It is a very interesting time in our place, and it is indeed. It's a transformative moment. I mean, things have changed here so fast and furious, and people, work from home now, and people go to school from home now, and go to college from home now. Things that previously just were for whatever reason weren't even that way. And now there's moves to um, just do all sorts of different things. The regulations that seem so important. The government's been willing to say, well, maybe they weren't so important anyway. Maybe we should let those go for now. While and things of this nature. I think there's a lot of people are really questioning why things were the way they were and are the way they are, and what they will be like in the future. And of course, this is the time that we must seize, because it is a transformative time. Can we afford to go back to the way things were? And how can we use the present situation to move forward in a different fashion? So these are, real questions. And this is the time to start thinking, because we do have so much time. A lot of us have time available to do this.
And ultimately, what will win the day for all of us, we get back to the original conversation, everyday acts of anarchy. That ultimately
Indeed
will deliver us. Folks, where can folks find out more? And I want you to engage in shameless self-promotion here. Where can folks reach out to the movement?
Okay, well, I would say if you haven't seen the documentary "Who is Vermin Supreme," that's available on Vimeo. That's the best place to watch it. All the other places, I think, are pirate. But Vimeo, "Who is Vermin Supreme," and that will let you know sort of pretty much who I am. It makes me look a little bit like a folk hero or whatever, but that is what it is. Now, if you do the Facebook, if you're a boomer on Facebook, you can go to the Vermin Supreme for President page, and that's got the blue check. That is the official page, and we got things going on there. On Twitter, at Vermin Supreme. On TikTok, at The Real Vermin Supreme. On Instagram, I think it's Vermin Supreme for President again. Where else are we? I think we got an official YouTube channel. I think it's just called Vermin Supreme. I'm not really sure about that, though. There's a I got a pretty big social media presence, and it's certainly bigger than I can even keep up with. So it's good to have some members on my team.
Excellent. Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's been wonderful. I really enjoyed the conversation.
VerminSupreme2020.com. VerminSupreme2020.com. Don't forget that one. VerminSupreme2020.com. And if you want to read my book, iPony, Blueprint for a New America, check that out. Go to iPonythebook.com. It's a great book. I tell you more about it. And VerminSupreme2020.com. Check out this merch. My other car is a pony, it says. Right? Am I right, people?
That's
How funny
outstanding.
Is that?
Everything. Well, again.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I just remembered the 2020.
No, it's all good. This is a stream of consciousness kind of show. That's why I think you and I have a good chemistry on this. We start with something, and God only knows where we'll end up. It's kind of like a Libertarian Party executive committee meeting. But I one of the things we're going to try and do in the next week or two, because folks are at home and they have plenty of time on their hands, and I'd like to point out that I believe we might be the first truly libertarian talk radio station here. It's all done digitally, but we do have a talk radio component. So one of the things we're working on, we're just we've been open for all of about 2 or 3 weeks. Excellent. But we'd love to have a couple of the candidates come on and literally just take phone calls from people. And if you're open for that, I'll touch base with Desiree and your campaign staff, and hopefully we can get you on again in the next couple of weeks. All right, buddy?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're sailing towards the convention. I think we're 6 weeks out, something like that.
Something. God only knows, for real. I mean, at this
Oh my
point.
goodness! And will there even be a convention? We don't even know. Will the LNC be the final arbitrator? Will Justin Amash enter the race? Will Jim Gray make it all the way? Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? The excitement never stops here.
It really. I don't know.
I think the most notable thing for me recently is the interjection into the presidential nomination race of the phrase by the judge, negative income tax.
Okay.
Just saying. Now, I'm not saying I support that, although I imagine that's something a lot of my supporters would. But I mean, that's he has interjected that. He has moved the Ovaltine window, brother. You know how far that Ovaltine window has just moved with that Georges concept? Quite a ways.
Listen, as we like to say here, a little dab will do you. The Are you a fan of the Carol Burnett TV show? Were you growing up? Were you a fan of that?
Oh yes, definitely. I'd say that informed my humor as a kid for sure. I thought that was some funny stuff.
She had the best way that I can describe Libertarian World on any given night is she did this marvelous skit. It was far gentler times and the humor was far family friendlier. But she did this constant takeoff on soap operas and she called it "As the Stomach Turns."
As the stomach turns, yes.
And I think some days that best sums up libertarian politics, as the stomach turns. But we're gonna say good night now. But again, thank you so much for joining us. I'll reach out to your campaign staff. We're gonna get everybody back on again for maybe some type of dial-in version where you actually talk to the person on an Ask Me Anything.
Oh, right? Okay.
But that's
sure. That sounds like a lot of fun. Thank you
so
very much. It was wonderful to see you again. Wonderful talking with you, and thank you so much for this opportunity to address your followers and your fans. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much, and see you on the internet, kids. Together, we will ride our ponies into a zombie-powered future.
It's time to scare the squares. Folks, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network here in the bunker high above the hills of Providence. Our spirit leaders behind us, our spirit animals, if you will, Spiro Agnew and Dick Cheney. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at CoalitionRadio.us. Folks, if you have a moment, follow us, like us, subscribe to us, all the good stuff. It is the mother's milk, if you will, of independent media. It's how we get above the noise, the fray, the confusion, the chaos, the fake news. So that's the only way we ask you for your support. We're going to take a couple-minute break. We're going to go dark for a few minutes, and then we're going to switch into a brief foray into Talk Radio Land. If you want to dial back or just keep the screen going, you can call the show at 401-205-3738. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a few moments.
Thank you, Pat.
Again. All right. Stay safe, as they say.